The night the Duke of Ashworth danced with every woman in the room, no one noticed he counted his steps. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. His lips never moved. His face never changed. But if you watched closely enough, if you were the kind of person who noticed things other people didn't bother to, you could see it. The faintest pause before each turn. A breath held just a half-second too long. Clara Ashby noticed. She noticed from across the ballroom, standing near the tall windows where the draft was cold enough to justify not dancing. She noticed while holding a glass of lemonade she hadn't touched. She noticed while pretending to listen to Mrs. Pemberton describe her daughter's new bonnet in extraordinary detail. She noticed and then she looked away. Because noticing the Duke of Ashworth was the kind of habit a sensible woman could not afford. The Hargrove Ball was, by every measurable account, the event of the season. 300 candles. A string quartet imported from Vienna. A guest list that had made grown women weep with relief upon receiving their invitation and weep again, differently, upon being left off it. The Hargrove townhouse on Grosvenor Square had been polished, pressed, and perfumed into something that barely resembled a place where actual human beings lived. Clara had been invited because her mother had once done Lady Hargrove a considerable favor involving a lost earring, a borrowed carriage, and a discretion that had never been spoken of again. It was not, Clara understood perfectly well, a social standing. It was a debt being repaid. She dressed accordingly. Her gown was pale blue, not fashionable, but clean and well-fitted, altered twice by her own hand because the seamstress cost money they didn't have. Her gloves were borrowed from her cousin. Her smile was entirely her own, and she wore it like armor. "Don't make enemies," her mother had whispered at the door. But more importantly, "don't make yourself small," Clara had nodded. She had been doing both things simultaneously for most of her 23 years. She was quite good at it. The ballroom was everything she'd expected and nothing she'd prepared for. Light fractured off crystal and diamonds, and the elaborate headdresses of women who had spent more on their hair tonight than Clara's family spent on coal in a winter. The music was beautiful. The laughter was loud. The air smelled of hothouse flowers and expensive perfume, and the particular anxiety of people performing happiness for one another. She found her corner by the windows within 10 minutes. It was a good corner. Good view. Slight draft. Excellent excuse to stay still. That was when she saw him. Edmund Ashworth, the 5th Duke of Ashworth, was not difficult to find in a room. It wasn't his height, though he was tall. It wasn't his clothes, though they were immaculate. It was the way people moved around him, not toward him, not away, but subtly, instinctively, like water adjusting around a stone. He occupied space differently than other men. He seemed entirely unbothered by the fact that half the room was watching him. He was dancing with Lady Forsyth. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Clara saw it immediately. The pause. The breath. The count behind his eyes. She looked away before she could think too much about it. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. "He's done his duty by the Forsyth girl," said a voice beside her. Mrs. Pemberton, materializing with a full glass of something amber and an expression of deep satisfaction. "Now he'll work through the list. He always does. Every season, every ball, the Duke dances with everyone. Never twice. Never once shown a preference." She sighed the sigh of a woman who had been tracking this data for years. "His mother insists on it, they say. Equal courtesy to all." Very noble. Very dull. Clara made a sound that could have meant anything. Of course, Mrs. Pemberton continued, lowering her voice to the volume she used when she wanted everyone nearby to hear. Equal courtesy is simply another way of saying no real interest in anyone. The man is 31 years old and still unmarried. At some point one has to wonder about his bonnet, Clara said pleasantly. Mrs. Pemberton blinked. I beg your pardon. You were telling me about your daughter's bonnet. I didn't want you to lose your place, Mrs. Pemberton lost her place entirely and wandered off to find a more appreciative audience. Clara exhaled slowly and turned back to the room. The Duke was now dancing with Miss Caldwell. Then Lady Anne Prescott. Then the eldest Hartley daughter. Methodical, courteous, utterly unreadable. When he reached Clara, she almost wasn't ready. Almost. He appeared at her left, not from across the room as she'd expected, but simply there, as if he had always been standing slightly to her left and she'd only just noticed. Up close, he was less intimidating than she'd anticipated, and somehow more. There were tired lines around his eyes that she hadn't been able to see from the windows. His expression was perfectly pleasant and completely closed. Miss Ashby, he said. He knew her name. She hadn't expected that either. Would you do me the honor? She set down her untouched lemonade. Of course, Your Grace. The floor was less crowded than it had been an hour ago. The music shifted into a waltz, something slower, more deliberate. He led well. Of course he did. She followed easily, because she'd had a good teacher, and because she refused to be the woman who stumbled in front of 300 people. 1, 2, 3. She could feel it in the slight tension of his hand. Counting. She didn't know why she said it. She would ask herself that for a long time afterward, in the carriage home, in bed that night, over breakfast the next morning. Why she said it. Whether she would say it again if she could go back. You count, she said quietly. Not an accusation. Almost a question. His hand stilled for just a fraction of a second. Less than a heartbeat. Enough. He looked at her then, really looked, not the polite glance he'd given every other woman, but something sharper and more direct, like a man who has just heard his name called in a room where no one should know it. He said something, low enough that the music swallowed it, low enough that no one standing 3 feet away could have heard. Clara heard it. She didn't respond. She couldn't. The music turned and they turned with it, and she kept her expression perfectly, carefully neutral for the remaining 2 minutes of the waltz because she was her mother's daughter, and she had been trained for exactly this, for the moments when everything shifts and you must not let your face show it. When the music ended, he bowed. She curtsied. He thanked her and moved on. Clara walked back to her corner, picked up her lemonade, did not drink it. She watched him finish his way through the room. Miss Ellison, Lady Blackwood, the youngest Hargrove niece who'd been dragged from the schoolroom for the occasion. Methodical, equal, done. The candles had burned lower. The quartet had shifted to something quieter. Guests were beginning their slow drift toward the supper room, toward their carriages, toward the end of the evening. Clara was reaching for her shawl when she felt it. A presence slightly to her left. She turned. Edmund Ashworth, 5th Duke of Ashworth, was standing before her for the second time that evening. His expression was the same as it had been an hour ago, pleasant, closed, giving nothing away. Except his hands. She looked down for just a moment. She couldn't help it. His hands, held correctly at his sides, were not quite still. "Miss Ashby," he said, "would you do me the honor?" The room noticed. Of course the room noticed. 300 people, and not one of them missed it. She felt the attention like a change in temperature, a sudden warmth from all directions, every eye in the ballroom finding them at once. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't name, not quite hope, not quite certainty. Something in between. Something that looked, she thought, a great deal like a man who has made a decision and is not entirely sure it was wise. Clara Ashby, who had stood in this corner all evening being sensible and careful and small enough not to make enemies, lifted her chin. "Of course, Your Grace," she said. And she did not count a single step. London decided what it meant before breakfast. By the time Clara's carriage had reached home the previous night, the whispers had already begun their work. By the time she sat down to her morning tea, they had traveled 3 streets in every direction. And by the time her mother appeared in the doorway of the sitting room, still in her dressing gown, hair unpinned, holding a letter she had clearly read more than once, they had become something closer to fact. "Mrs. Pemberton wrote," her mother said. "I imagine she did. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Clara. She must have been up early." Her mother sat down, set the letter on the table between them, and smoothed it once, twice, as though it might say something different if pressed flat enough. "He asked you twice." "Yes, the Duke of Ashworth asked you to dance twice." "In front of everyone. There were perhaps 300 people," Clara said. "So not quite everyone, but a significant portion." Her mother looked at her for a long moment. She was a practical woman. She had needed to be, after Clara's father left them with more debts than furniture and more pride than sense. She did not believe in fairy tales. She did not believe in luck. She believed in facts, in careful management, and in the particular arithmetic of survival that had kept them respectable for 11 years through sheer determination. But her eyes just now were doing something dangerously close to hoping. "What did he say to you?" she asked. "The first dance. You came back different." Clara wrapped both hands around her teacup. "Nothing of consequence. It wasn't entirely a lie." She still wasn't sure what it was. The first call came at 11. Miss Georgiana Hartley, who had also been at the ball and who had watched the second dance with an expression Clara remembered as somewhere between astonishment and illness. She arrived with her mother, a tin of biscuits, and approximately 45 minutes of very thinly veiled interrogation dressed up as friendly concern. "Of course we always knew you were remarkable," Miss Hartley said, in the tone of someone who had never once thought this. "There's simply something about you, Clara. Something the Duke must have seen immediately. He danced with everyone," Clara said. "I happened to be the last." "He danced with everyone once," Miss Hartley's mother corrected gently. She had the careful precision of a woman who had been tracking the Duke of Ashworth's behavior across multiple seasons. "He has never, in 4 years of attending the Hargrove ball, asked any woman twice. Not once. Not even Lady Forsyth, and her father has a fleet." Clara smiled, said nothing, and offered more tea. They left at noon, and were replaced almost immediately by 2 women from her mother's church circle, who had not spoken to them in 3 months, and now had a great deal to say. Then a neighbor. Then a cousin who had traveled, Clara suspected, a considerable distance specifically for this conversation. By 3 o'clock, she had received more visitors than they typically saw in a month. By 4 o'clock, she had developed a headache. By 5, she had made her decision. She found her mother in the small parlor, working through the household accounts with the focused misery of a woman doing long division on bad news. Clara sat across from her and folded her hands. "If he asks," she said, "I'm going to say no." Her mother set down her pen. Very slowly, with great control. "I beg your pardon, if the Duke calls. If he makes his interest known. If anything comes of last night." Clara kept her voice steady. She had rehearsed this somewhat in the mirror. "I won't accept it, Clara. I'm not a charity case. I'm not a project. I won't be the woman a Duke dances with twice out of curiosity or pity or whatever it was, and then finds himself obligated to. You don't know what it was." "No," she agreed. "I don't. And that's precisely the problem." Her mother looked at her for a long time. Long enough that Clara almost changed her mind, almost said something different, almost admitted that she had lain awake until 2 in the morning turning over those 4 words he'd said to her on the dance floor until they'd lost all meaning and gained it back again in a different shape. "He hasn't called," her mother said finally. "He hasn't written. He may not do anything at all. You may be refusing a situation that doesn't exist." "I know," Clara said. "But I wanted you to know where I stand." Her mother picked up her pen, looked at the accounts, and put the pen down again. "Your father," she said quietly, "also had very firm ideas about where he stood." Clara said nothing. That particular comparison was too sharp to answer. 3 days passed. Then 4. Then a week. No call. No letter. No word of any kind from Ashworth House on Berkeley Square, which Mrs. Pemberton had confirmed was where the Duke resided when in London, along with several other details Clara had not asked for and could not now unknow. The visitors slowed. The questions became more careful, more pitying. Miss Hartley, passing her in the street, gave her a look of such elaborate sympathy that Clara had to cross to the other side to avoid saying something she'd regret. She didn't regret saying no, she told herself. She hadn't even said no. There had been nothing to say no to. She had simply been prepared. She was still prepared. She was also, if she was being honest with herself in the quiet hours of the evening, when honesty was harder to avoid, waiting. Not waiting, not with any expectation or hope or foolishness. Simply aware. Of every carriage that slowed on their street. Of every letter that arrived. Of the particular silence of a door that did not knock. She was not waiting. She was simply attentive. It was on the 8th day that she saw him. She had gone with her mother to Lady Whitmore's afternoon gathering, a smaller affair, 30 or so women, tea and conversation, and the particular social work of being seen and pleasant and unremarkable. Clara had managed all 3 successfully for nearly an hour. Then she turned from the window. Edmund Ashworth was across the room. He was not supposed to be there. It was not that sort of gathering. Men occasionally appeared at Lady Whitmore's, but briefly, by accident almost, a husband collecting his wife, a brother passing through. They did not stay. They did not stand in the corner near the pianoforte looking entirely at ease, while 30 women recalibrated the entire afternoon around their presence. He was speaking to someone. Clara looked. The woman beside him was laughing at something he'd said, really laughing, not the careful musical laugh of a woman performing amusement, but the sudden helpless kind that escapes before you can refine it. Her hand was on his arm. Her face was turned up toward his, open and unguarded. Clara recognized her immediately. Violet Ashby. Her cousin. Her dearest friend for 11 years. The person who knew every secret she had ever kept. The woman who had asked her just last Tuesday how she was feeling about the whole Duke business, and listened with such careful, warm attention. Violet, who had said nothing about knowing him. Violet, who was laughing now at something Clara couldn't hear, in a way Clara had never quite seen her laugh before. Edmund Ashworth said something else. Violet laughed again. And then, as though he felt the weight of it, the Duke looked up. Across the room. Directly at Clara. His expression didn't change. Not a flicker. He held her gaze for 2 seconds, perhaps 3, and then he looked back at Violet as though Clara were simply another woman in a room full of them. Which was, of course, exactly what she was. She had said so herself. Clara turned back to the window. Outside, a carriage horse was being very patient about standing still in the rain. She watched it for a while. She made her face do nothing at all. She was very good at that. But her hands, wrapped around her teacup, were not quite still. The thing about pride, Clara had learned, was that it kept you very warm right up until the moment it didn't. She said nothing to Violet that afternoon. She smiled, she finished her tea. She listened to Lady Whitmore describe her recent trip to Bath with what she hoped was convincing interest. She watched Violet say goodbye to the Duke from across the room, watched him bow, watched Violet smile, watched neither of them look in her direction. And she felt something harden quietly in her chest, like water turning to ice so gradually you don't notice until you try to move and find you can't. In the carriage home, her mother asked if she was all right. Perfectly, Clara said. Her mother looked at her, the way she always looked at her when she said perfectly. Clara looked out the window. She gave Violet 3 days. This was generous, she felt. 3 days was enough time for Violet to mention it herself, to bring it up naturally, to say, "Oh, by the way, I've met the Duke of Ashworth." Isn't that strange, in the easy offhand way of someone with nothing to conceal? Violet talked about her new hat, about a novel she was reading, about a neighbor's dog that had escaped twice in 1 week and caused considerable chaos on the high street. She talked about everything with her usual warmth and ease. She did not mention Edmund Ashworth. On the 4th day, Clara mentioned him herself. "I saw you at Lady Whitmore's," she said. They were walking in the park, the kind of pale autumn afternoon that couldn't quite decide whether to be beautiful or miserable. With the Duke, Violet's step didn't falter. But something in her posture shifted, barely, briefly, the way a candle flame adjusts when a door opens somewhere in the house. "Yes," she said. "We were introduced some weeks ago. At the Ellison dinner," a pause carefully timed. "I didn't think it worth mentioning. Weeks ago, it was a brief acquaintance. I didn't imagine he's been to see you since. It wasn't a question." Violet was quiet for a moment, which was answer enough. "Clara, you could have told me. I know. After everything, after the ball, after everything I said to you, everything I told you in confidence, you were meeting with him and saying nothing." Clara kept her voice level. She was proud of that afterward. "What were you discussing, Violet, in all these weeks of not mentioning it?" Violet stopped walking and turned to face her. Her expression was complicated, guilty, yes, but also something else, something that looked almost like frustration, which Clara found extraordinary under the circumstances. "I was trying to help you," she said. "I didn't ask for help, no. You never do. That's rather the problem." Violet's voice was gentle but direct, the voice of a woman who had been patient a long time and was running low. "He asked about you, Clara. At the Ellison dinner. He sought out the introduction, specifically because he knew we were close. He wanted to understand you better, and he didn't know how to. He said you were—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "He said I was what? Difficult to read." The words landed strangely. Clara wasn't sure what she'd expected, but it wasn't that. He said you were unlike anyone he'd met at any ball in 4 years, Violet continued quietly. And that he'd managed, apparently, to make things worse by saying nothing for a week, and he didn't know how to, she exhaled. He's not very good at this, Clara. He knows it. He was asking me, essentially, whether there was any hope of stop. Clara started walking again. Please stop. You should have told me. Her voice was still level. She was going to keep it level if it killed her. Whatever his reasons, whatever yours, you should have told me. And now I find I don't know quite what to do with any of it. They walked in silence for a while. The park was mostly empty. A child was feeding ducks near the pond with total absorption, entirely indifferent to the quiet catastrophe happening on the path behind her. What are you going to do? Violet asked finally. Clara had been asking herself the same question for approximately 4 minutes. The right thing, she said, which told them both nothing at all. She wrote the letter that evening. She sat at the small writing desk in her bedroom, the one with the uneven leg that had to be propped with a folded piece of card, and she composed it with great care. 3 drafts. The first was too cold. The second was too much the other direction, too revealing, too close to the thing she wasn't willing to put on paper. The third was, she felt, correct. Your Grace, I hope this letter finds you well. I write only to say that whatever impression the events of last Thursday may have created, I would not wish you to feel any obligation arising from them. You have been all that is courteous, and I have no doubt your intentions were entirely honorable. Whatever you intended that evening, I assure you, sir, I require nothing from you. Yours respectfully, Miss Clara Ashby. She read it twice. It was good. It was clear and dignified, and it closed the door firmly without slamming it. It gave him every excuse to simply agree and move on, which was, she told herself, exactly what she wanted. She sealed it before she could think further. She gave it to the footboy in the morning before she'd had her tea, because she knew that if she had her tea first, she would sit with the letter in her hands and eventually put it back in the drawer. By 10 o'clock it was gone. By noon she was regretting it. Not because she'd said the wrong thing. She hadn't. Every word was accurate. She did require nothing from him. She had meant every syllable. But there was a difference, she was discovering, between meaning something and being glad you'd said it. A very uncomfortable difference that sat in the chest all day, and didn't improve with tea or fresh air or rational thinking. She went to bed early, told her mother she had a headache, lay in the dark and looked at the ceiling and was very sensible and composed about the entire situation. She was still awake at midnight. She learned what had happened to the letter from Violet. Not directly, Violet heard it from Mrs. Pemberton's niece, who had it from a housemaid at Ashworth House, which was exactly the kind of route by which important information traveled in London, whether anyone wanted it to or not. Edmund Ashworth had received the letter on a Tuesday morning. He had read it in his study, alone, which was apparently unusual. He typically dealt with correspondence at his desk with his secretary present. He had sent the secretary out. Read it. And then, according to the housemaid who had been bringing in the coal scuttle, and had therefore witnessed this without technically eavesdropping, he had laughed. Clara received this information on a Thursday afternoon, sitting in Violet's parlor with a cup of tea going cold in her hand. Laughed, she repeated. That's what she said. He laughed. Yes, Clara set down the cup. Picked it up again. Put it back. She had written him a careful, dignified, entirely reasonable letter, and he had laughed at it. According to the housemaid, and Clara hated that she was relying on a housemaid's account of facial expressions. She hated it thoroughly. It was not a happy laugh at all. It was the laugh of someone receiving news they had perhaps expected and found confirmed in the worst possible way. Which meant something. She wasn't entirely sure what, but it meant something, and she was still working out what that something was when Violet said, very quietly, "He's leaving London." Clara looked up. His man of business mentioned it to someone at the club. "He's gone to the estate in Wiltshire. Closed the London house." Violet's voice was careful, gentle in the way of someone delivering bad news to a person who will insist they don't care about it. "They say he won't be back this season." The fire crackled. Outside, rain had started against the windows, the serious, determined kind that intended to stay. Clara looked at her tea. It had gone quite cold. He always does. Every season, every ball, the Duke dances with everyone. Never twice. Mrs. Pemberton's voice, from what felt like a very long time ago. Never once shown a preference. Clara stood up. She wasn't sure why. There was nowhere to go. She was in Violet's parlor on a rainy Thursday, and there was nowhere in particular to be. But sitting felt wrong. Everything felt slightly wrong, slightly tilted, like a picture frame knocked just a fraction off the wall. "Clara," Violet said. "I need to think," Clara said. "Of course, I might have," she stopped. Started again. The letter was a mistake. Violet said nothing. She had the grace, at least, to simply let that stand without saying she'd known it all along. Clara walked to the window and pressed 2 fingers against the cold glass. Outside, the rain was very committed to its work. A woman across the street was struggling, with an umbrella that had given up entirely. She thought about a man counting steps in a ballroom. About hands that weren't quite still. About 4 words said low enough that the music almost swallowed them, almost but not quite. She thought about a letter she couldn't take back. And then slowly, she thought about Wiltshire. Wiltshire was 4 hours by carriage on a good road. Clara knew this because she had looked it up. Not because she was planning anything. She was not planning anything. She was simply a person who liked to be informed. But because there was a particular kind of torment in not knowing the exact distance between yourself and a mistake you couldn't unmake, and knowing it was, somehow, marginally better. 4 hours. She could leave at 7 and arrive before noon. She was not going. She sat with this knowledge for 6 days. She went about her life with perfect normalcy. She called on neighbors, helped her mother with the accounts, attended a small dinner at the Hartleys, where no one mentioned the Duke more than twice, which she considered a personal victory. She slept. She ate. She was completely, entirely, convincingly fine. On the 7th day, Violet came to call. She arrived without warning, which was her habit, at 9:30 in the morning, before Clara had fully assembled herself into the composed and sensible person she intended to be for the rest of the day. She sat down in the good chair without being invited and produced, from her bag, a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table. Clara looked at it. "What is that?" "Something you need to know," Violet said. "Before you do whatever it is you're pretending not to be planning." "I'm not planning anything, Clara. I'm not." Violet tapped the paper once with one finger and said nothing. Which was, Clara had always found, one of the more infuriating things she did. Clara picked up the paper. It was a letter. Not to Clara, not to anyone exactly. It was written in a woman's hand, older and more elaborate than the current fashion, on paper that had been folded and unfolded enough times to be soft at the creases. It was from Edmund's mother. The Dowager Duchess of Ashworth had written it to Violet 3 weeks ago, before the ball, before any of it. Violet had kept it, she explained quietly, because she hadn't known what to do with it, and then events had moved quickly, and then she had been trying to help in her own imperfect way, and she was sorry, and Clara should read it, and she would wait. Clara read it. The letter was not long. The Dowager was clearly a woman who didn't waste words. She had, it explained, arranged the Hargrove ball with particular attention. Not the entire ball, she was not so dramatic as that, but certain elements. The guest list had been reviewed. The timing of certain invitations had been managed. Clara's name, specifically, had been placed on the list not through Lady Hargrove's goodwill and an old debt about an earring, as Clara had always believed. It had been placed there by the Dowager Duchess herself. Clara read that sentence twice. The Dowager had heard of Clara through a chain of connections too elaborate to fully trace. A friend of a cousin, the particular telegraph of respectable women that operated invisibly beneath the surface of London society. She had heard that Clara Ashby was clever and poor and proud, and that she had once told Lord Fenwick, at a dinner party, that his opinion on the Irish question was not only wrong but embarrassingly under-researched, and had then cited 4 specific sources, 2 of which Lord Fenwick had clearly never heard of. The Dowager had found this, apparently, extremely promising. Her son, she wrote, had been making her tired for 3 years. Not through any fault of character. He was a good man. She was not a mother who said this without meaning it, but because he had developed, somewhere in the long, difficult years of his father's illness and his own early inheritance, the habit of performing duty so thoroughly that she sometimes wondered if he remembered there was a person underneath it. He danced with everyone. He was courteous to everyone. He decided nothing. She had begun to despair of finding a woman who would simply be herself in front of him, who would not perform back. And then she heard about Clara Ashby and Lord Fenwick's Irish question. She had arranged the invitation. She had, on the night of the ball, said something to her son before the dancing began. Not a push, she wrote. She was not so clumsy as that. Simply an observation. She had pointed out a young woman standing by the tall windows who had been holding an untouched glass of lemonade for 40 minutes and who appeared to be listening to Mrs. Pemberton with the patience of a saint and the eyes of someone planning an escape. She is the only woman in this room, the Dowager had said, who has not looked at you once. Edmund had looked. Clara looked up from the letter. Looked back down. She is the only woman in this room who has not looked at you once. Not she is the only one who hasn't tried to impress you. The difference was small. The difference was, somehow, everything. She hadn't been not trying to impress him. She had simply been genuinely, entirely unaware of him. Until she wasn't. She kept reading. The second dance, the Dowager wrote, had not been her idea. She wanted to be clear about that. She had suggested nothing beyond the initial observation. What her son did after the first dance was entirely his own affair, and she had watched it from across the room with something she could only describe as cautious astonishment, because Edmund did not do impulsive things. Edmund did not deviate from the careful architecture of his own behavior without considerable internal reckoning. He had asked Clara twice because he had decided to. It was, the Dowager wrote, the first time in 4 years she had seen him decide something for himself rather than for duty, propriety, or the management of other people's expectations. She had rather hoped Clara would not ruin it. The letter ended there. Clara sat with it in her lap for a long moment. The fire had burned low. Somewhere in the kitchen, her mother was talking to the cook about something involving onions. The sounds of the house went on around her, ordinary and unchanged, while something inside her was rearranging itself into a different shape. "How long have you had this?" she asked. "Since before the ball," Violet said. I know, Clara. I didn't know how to give it to you without it seeming like. I didn't want you to feel managed. And then the ball happened, and everything moved so fast, and then your letter," she exhaled. "I handled it badly. I'm sorry." Clara looked at the letter again. He had asked Clara twice, because he had decided to. She thought about the week of silence after the ball, Edmund not calling, not writing, while she waited in her corner telling herself she wasn't waiting. She had assumed, she realized, without question that his silence meant indifference, carelessness, the comfortable inaction of a man who could afford to take his time with a woman who had very little of it to spare. She had assumed the power was entirely his. She had not considered that he might be counting steps in that silence too. That the pause before each turn might be fear as much as habit. She had not considered that she might have been the one thing he couldn't quite calculate. And then she had sent him a letter telling him she required nothing from him, which was, she could see it now with a horrible clarity, not the dignified exit she'd intended but something that must have read, to a man who had taken a significant and uncharacteristic risk, and then heard nothing for a week, like a door closing. He had laughed because it hurt. She stood up. "Clara, I need to borrow your carriage," she said. "Mine will take too long to prepare, and I'd like to leave within the hour." Violet stared at her. "You're going to Wiltshire. I'm going to Wiltshire. Clara, you cannot simply arrive at a duke's country estate without what?" Clara was already moving toward the door. "An invitation. A chaperone. A better plan than this one. Any of those things, yes. I sent him a letter telling him I required nothing from him," Clara said, turning in the doorway. "I need to go and tell him that I lied." Violet opened her mouth, closed it, looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was half exasperation and half something much warmer. "The carriage will be ready in 20 minutes, she said. The road to Wiltshire was exactly 4 hours on a good road. It was not that day a particularly good road. Clara sat with her hands in her lap, and the dowager's letter folded in her pocket, and watched the city give way to countryside, and tried very hard not to rehearse what she was going to say, because every version she rehearsed sounded wrong in a different way, and she was beginning to think that perhaps the words would have to come from somewhere other than careful preparation. She thought about a man who counted steps in ballrooms. She thought about hands that weren't quite still. She thought about 4 words, said low enough that the music almost swallowed them. Almost, but not quite. She had heard them perfectly, standing in the middle of a crowded ballroom with 300 candles and a Viennese quartet, and the elaborate performance of an entire season going on around her. She had heard them, and she had not answered, and she had spent weeks since then turning them over in the dark. "You see too much." That was what he'd said. The first dance. Low enough for only her. Not a complaint. Not quite a warning. Something in between. The voice of a man who has just realized he has been seen, and is not entirely sure whether to be relieved or terrified. She had not answered because she hadn't known what to say. She knew now. The carriage turned through a gate. A long drive, elm trees on both sides, the house appearing at the end of it like a statement, large and old and serious, the kind of house that had been standing long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. Clara straightened her spine. She was not, she told herself, nervous. Her hands, folded in her lap, were not quite still. The butler who opened the door was very good at his job. The butler's face, upon finding an unaccompanied young woman of clearly modest means standing on the front steps of Ashworth Park at 11:30 on a Wednesday morning, gave away absolutely nothing. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at him. The elm trees moved slightly in the wind behind her. "Miss Ashby," she said, "for the Duke of Ashworth. He is not expecting me." A lesser butler might have raised an eyebrow. This one simply said, "If you would wait here, miss," in a tone that communicated neither approval nor disapproval but a vast professional neutrality, and closed the door with the quiet precision of a man who had seen stranger things and intended to see stranger things still before he retired. Clara waited. The steps were cold. The wind had picked up since the carriage. She had not brought a heavier coat because she had left in under an hour, and she had not been thinking about coats. She stood very straight and looked at the door, and did not let herself think about what happened if Edmund simply refused to come down. He might refuse. It was entirely within his rights. She had written him a letter closing a door, and now she was standing on his front steps without an invitation, and there was no version of this that was not, by every social measure she had ever been taught, completely outrageous. Her mother was going to be beside herself. The door opened. Not the butler. A woman, older, small, with sharp dark eyes and white hair, and the bearing of someone who had been formidable for so long it had simply become her natural state. She was dressed simply for the country, nothing elaborate, but she wore it the way certain women wore everything, as though clothing were merely the least interesting thing about her. She looked at Clara with an expression of undisguised assessment. Clara looked back. "You came," the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth said. "You arranged it," Clara replied. Something moved in the older woman's eyes, not quite a smile, but its immediate neighbor. "Not this part," she said. "This part is entirely your own." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I came." The Dowager stepped back from the door. "He's in the library. First floor, east corridor. He'll hear you on the stairs, he always does." She paused. "He has been in the library for 11 days. He has read, as far as I can determine, nothing." Clara stepped inside. The house was quieter than she'd expected. Large houses often had a particular kind of noise, staff, movement, the constant low machinery of a working estate. Ashworth Park had all of that somewhere, but muffled, distant, as though the house itself was holding something in reserve. Her footsteps on the marble were very clear. She found the stairs and went up. The east corridor was lined with portraits, Ashworth's going back 2 centuries, various degrees of solemnity, the same jaw recurring with the persistence of a family that knew what it was and intended to keep being it. Clara walked past them without looking. She was conserving her attention. The library door was ajar. She could see, through the gap, the edge of a desk, a window beyond it with gray Wiltshire light coming through, the corner of a chair. She pushed the door open. Edmund Ashworth was standing at the window with his back to her. He was not in London clothes, no coat, no cravat, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, the particular dishevelment of a man who has stopped performing for an audience. He was looking out at the grounds, which were wet and brown and going quietly into winter. He had heard her on the stairs. She knew because his shoulders had changed, barely, the way a man's do when he has been very still for a long time and something has shifted in the room. He did not turn around. Clara stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The latch was very loud in the silence. "You shouldn't be here," he said. Not unkindly. Stating a fact. "No," she agreed. "You came alone. Yes, from London. It's 4 hours on a good road, she said. It was not today a particularly good road. A pause. Something in his posture shifted again. That almost not there adjustment that she realized, beginning to be able to read the way you learn to read weather. Why are you here, Miss Ashby? Clara had spent 4 hours in a carriage not rehearsing this. She had been very disciplined about it. And now she was standing in a library in Wiltshire with cold feet and no good coat and a man's back turned to her, and everything she had not rehearsed simply arranged itself into the truest order it could find. I sent you a letter, she said. I received it, you laughed. He was quiet for a moment. Who told you that? Does it matter? Another pause. Longer. It wasn't, he stopped. Began again. It wasn't the laugh you might have imagined. I know that now, Clara said. I didn't know it then. Then I thought, she stopped herself from listing what she'd thought, because the list was long and most of it was unflattering to her own judgment. I thought the letter was the right thing to do. I was protecting myself. From what? From wanting something I wasn't sure I was allowed to want. The words sat in the air between them. Clara felt her heart doing something irregular and inconvenient, and entirely outside her control. Edmund turned around. She had not seen his face in 11 days. She had spent a considerable portion of those 11 days telling herself she didn't remember it precisely. That memory was unreliable, that she had probably constructed something more significant than reality in the private dark of her own imagination. She had not. If anything, she had remembered it as less. He looked tired, more than tired. He looked like a man who had been sitting alone in a library for 11 days with a letter he hadn't answered and a decision he hadn't made, and it had cost him something. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the ballroom the second time. Sharp and direct and uncertain, in a way that was almost unbearable on a face so accustomed to giving nothing away. The letter said you required nothing from me, he said. I know what it said. Did you mean it? No, Clara said. I meant every word of it, and I didn't mean any of it, and I have been extremely uncomfortable about that ever since. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile yet. The shape a smile makes before it decides to arrive. I didn't write back, he said. I noticed. I didn't know what to say. Everything I thought to write sounded. He paused. I don't do this well, Miss Ashby. I want to be honest with you about that from the beginning. I am considerably better at duty than I am at. He stopped again. At deciding things for yourself, Clara said. He looked at her carefully. My mother told you. Your mother wrote a letter. Violet gave it to me. It took rather longer to reach me than it should have, but I have it now. She held his gaze. She said you asked me twice because you decided to. Yes, not because of protocol. Not because of obligation. No, because you wanted to. Yes, quiet. Unambiguous. The single most direct thing she had heard him say. Clara exhaled slowly. I noticed you counting, she said. At the ball. Before you ever spoke to me. I noticed and I looked away because noticing you felt like the beginning of something I wasn't sure I was prepared for. Were you prepared? No. I'm not sure I'm prepared now. She looked at him steadily. I came anyway. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the Wiltshire countryside went about its gray November business, entirely indifferent to what was happening in the library. Somewhere downstairs, a clock was ticking with patient persistence. Edmund moved away from the window, not toward her, not yet, just away from it, as though standing with his back to the room was no longer the right position for this conversation. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her. You said something to me, he said. The first dance, you counted your steps, and you noticed. He was watching her carefully. I have danced with a great many women, Miss Ashby. Not one of them ever noticed. Most of them were too busy being noticed themselves. I wasn't there to be noticed, Clara said. I was there because of an old debt about an earring, or so I thought. I know. A pause. I put you on that list, Clara blinked. Your mother, my mother, suggested it. I approved it. He said it simply, without apology. I had heard things about you. Specific things. I wanted to see if they were true. Lord Fenwick's Irish question, among others. Something warmer moved across his face. They were true. Clara looked at him. This man who counted steps in ballrooms and laughed at letters that hurt him, and had sat alone in a library for 11 days, because she had closed a door without meaning to. This man whose hands had not been quite still when he asked her to dance the second time. She thought about what she hadn't said on the dance floor. The answer she hadn't given to 4 words that had been sitting in her chest ever since, waiting. You said I see too much, she said. You do. You didn't say it as a complaint. No. What did you mean by it? Edmund was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer, long enough that she started to construct an alternative interpretation, a safer one, something less. I meant, he said carefully, that I have spent a great deal of my life being looked at and not seen. And you saw something in 30 seconds that most people don't find in 30 years. He paused. It was the most alarming thing that had happened to me in quite some time. And yet you came back, Clara said. The second dance. Yes. Why? He looked at her, the tired lines around his eyes, the mouth that was still deciding about the smile, the hands at his sides that were, she noticed, not quite still. Because, he said, it was the first time in 4 years that I stopped counting. The clock downstairs ticked on. The wind moved against the windows. Somewhere in the house, the Dowager Duchess of Ashworth was almost certainly listening at nothing and knowing everything. Clara took 1 step forward. It was not a large step. It covered perhaps 2 feet of Wiltshire library floor. But it was, she understood, the step, the one that could not be taken back, that meant something irrevocable and clear. That was as close to saying I am here and I mean to stay as she could get without speaking it aloud. Edmund looked at the step. Looked at her. And then he did something she hadn't seen him do. Not at the ball, not in the brief glimpse across Lady Whitmore's crowded room, not in any of the constructed versions of him she'd carried in her imagination for weeks. He smiled. Really smiled. Not the careful, pleasant expression he wore like a second coat, not the almost there thing at the corner of his mouth, but a full, unguarded smile that changed his whole face and made him look, suddenly, like a man who had just put down something very heavy. He reached out his hand. Not the formal offer of a dance floor. Not gloved, not correct, not performed. Just his hand, open, in the space between them. Clara looked at it. She thought about a pale blue dress, altered twice by her own hand. About borrowed gloves and untouched lemonade, and a corner by the window where the draft was cold enough to justify not dancing. She thought about all the ways she had made herself small and careful, and prepared for disappointment. She thought about 4 hours on a bad road, and a letter she couldn't take back, and a woman who had done the most outrageous thing she had ever done in her life, and walked through a stranger's door without an invitation, because she had something true to say, and no one else was going to say it for her. She took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm, certain, the grip of a man who has finally decided something and intends to stay decided. Neither of them spoke for a moment. I should tell you, Clara said at last, that I have no dowry to speak of, a mother who will require significant reassurance, and a cousin who will almost certainly take full credit for this. Violet has earned some credit, Edmund said. Don't tell her that. She'll be insufferable, he laughed. Properly this time, the real kind, the kind that had nothing to do with hurt. It was a better sound than she'd imagined, and she had, in the privacy of her own mind, imagined it rather often. Miss Ashby, he said. Clara, she said. I think we're past Miss Ashby. Clara. He said it once carefully, like something being placed in the right position after a long time in the wrong one. I don't do this well. I want you to know that I know that. I know, she said. I don't either, she looked up at him. We'll manage. Outside, the November light shifted just slightly, just enough, and for a moment the library was warmer than it had any right to be. 1 year later, the Hargrove Ball was, as always, the event of the season. 300 candles. The Vienna Quartet again, or one very like it. A guest list that had been discussed, dissected, and argued over for the better part of 2 months in drawing rooms across Mayfair. Clara stood near the tall windows. Old habit. The draft was still cold. She still didn't mind it. She was wearing green silk this year. Not pale, not careful, not the color of a woman trying not to be noticed. Deep green, the color of a decision made and kept. Her gloves were her own. Her mother, seated across the room with the satisfied expression of a woman whose arithmetic had finally come out right, caught her eye and gave her a small nod. Clara nodded back. She watched Edmund work through the room. He was very good at it, still, courteous to everyone, attentive to each in turn, the careful architecture of his public manner assembled as precisely as ever. Lady Forsyth. Miss Caldwell. The eldest Hartley daughter, who had married in the spring and brought her younger sister along to try her luck. He moved through them all with his usual unhurried grace, and if you didn't know to look for it, if you hadn't spent a year learning to read the weather of him, you would have seen nothing but duty, performed immaculately. Clara knew to look. You're smiling, said Violet, appearing at her elbow with a glass of champagne and an expression of great self-satisfaction. I'm always smiling. You're smiling like that, Violet nodded toward Edmund. You only smile like that when you're watching him. I smile like this at many things. Name one, Clara considered. Particularly good tea, Violet laughed. She had been laughing more easily this year. Clara had noticed something had loosened in her, some long-held tension she hadn't known was there until it wasn't. She had also, quietly and without announcement, begun corresponding with a solicitor in Bath, whose opinion on property law she had found unexpectedly interesting. Clara had not pressed. She had simply noticed, and smiled like that and said nothing. Some things didn't need managing. There's Miss Hartley watching him, Violet said. The younger one. She's been watching since he arrived. Most people watch him. She's doing the calculation. Whether she has a chance. Clara looked at the younger Miss Hartley, 17 perhaps, fresh from the schoolroom, her eyes following Edmund with the particular intensity of a girl who has just discovered that wanting something is different from understanding it. She remembered that feeling. Standing by these same windows, holding untouched lemonade, telling herself she wasn't watching. She had been watching. She'll work it out, Clara said, not unkindly. Across the room, Edmund finished his dance with Lady Blackwood, bowed, thanked her and moved on. Miss Hartley straightened almost imperceptibly, arranged her expression into something she hoped was effortless. Ready. Edmund passed her with a courteous nod and kept walking. Clara watched him cross the room, unhurried, certain, the crowd parting for him the way it always did, water adjusting around a stone, and he came through it without appearing to notice, without breaking stride, without once looking at anything except the direction he had already decided to go. He stopped beside her, slightly to her left. "Old habit." "Your Grace," said Mrs. Pemberton, materializing with the punctuality of a woman who had been waiting exactly here for exactly this. "What a delightful evening. I was just telling Lady Hargrove that the flowers, while not quite Mrs. Pemberton," Edmund said pleasantly. "Forgive me," he turned to Clara. Up close his face was the same as it had always been, the tired lines a little softer this year, the careful pleasant expression present but worn more lightly, like a coat you keep because it's good quality but no longer need for warmth. His eyes found hers with the directness she had stopped being surprised by and had never stopped being glad of. "Clara," he said. "Not Miss Ashby. Not your Grace. Just Clara and Edmund, in a room full of people who were pretending not to watch." "Edmund," she said. He offered his hand, not formally, not the gloved, correct, performed gesture of a man fulfilling an obligation, just his hand, open, the way it had been in the library in Wiltshire on a cold November morning when everything had finally said what it meant. She took it. They moved to the floor. Mrs. Pemberton watched. Miss Hartley watched. Violet watched from the window with an expression she would later describe as entirely unsentimental, and which was, in fact, nothing of the kind. Lady Hargrove watched and felt, privately, that the Hargrove ball had once again justified its considerable expense. The music began. Clara felt it immediately, the familiar steadiness of his lead, the particular way he held her, certain and unhurried. She had danced with him many times in the past year. At their own house in the drawing room, when the music on the pianoforte was good, and the evening was fine, and there was no reason to be anywhere else. She knew how he danced now. She knew all of it. 1, 2, 3. She waited. 1, 2, 3. Turn. 1, 2, nothing. No count. No pause. No breath held half a second too long. Just the music, and his hand in hers, and the particular ease of a man who has stopped performing and started simply being. She looked up at him. He was already looking at her. He usually was, she had found, in rooms full of people and in rooms with no one else, and in all the ordinary moments in between. He had a way of finding her that she had stopped remarking on because it had become simply the texture of her days, the thing that was always there. "You're not counting," she said. "No, you haven't counted in quite some time. Not since a certain evening," he said, when someone pointed it out. The music turned. They turned with it. Around them the ball went on, the candles burning, the crowd moving, the elaborate seasonal performance of London society proceeding as it always had and always would, indifferent to the small private revolutions happening in its midst. Clara thought about a girl in a pale blue dress, standing by cold windows telling herself she wasn't watching. About borrowed gloves and untouched lemonade, and all the careful ways she had prepared herself for disappointment. About 4 hours on a bad road and one true thing said in a library, and a hand, open in the space between them. About the precise moment when a door you thought was closing turns out to be opening. "They're watching," Edmund said quietly. "Not bothered. Just noting. They're always watching. Does it trouble you?" Clara considered the question honestly, all the way down to where the real answer lived. "No," she said. "Let them watch." The music moved toward its end. She felt Edmund's hand, warm, certain, the grip of a man who had decided something and stayed decided. not the careful formal hold of a duke performing duty. The hold of a man who had put something down a year ago and had no intention of picking it back up. 1 dance left. 8 bars, perhaps. 7. Edmund, she said. Yes, ask me again. He looked at her, that look, the sharp, direct one, the one that saw everything and didn't look away from it. Then the smile, arriving the way it always did now, without hesitation, changing his whole face. The last note sounded. The room shifted, couples separating, the floor opening up. Edmund did not move. He looked at her for a moment, just long enough. And then he did what he had done once before in this same room, with the same candles and the same music and 100 people watching, and his hands not quite still. He offered his hand. "Clara," he said, "would you do me the honor?" She looked at his hand, looked at him, at the man who counted steps in ballrooms until he didn't, who laughed at letters that hurt him, who had sat alone in a library for 11 days and met her halfway, who had stopped performing and started deciding, and had not once, in an entire year, made her feel like a woman who needed to stand by cold windows pretending she wasn't watching. Across the room, Violet caught her eye, raised her champagne glass slightly. The expression on her face said, "I told you so, and you're welcome, and don't cry. This is a ballroom all at once." Mrs. Pemberton beside her had gone completely silent. That, Clara thought, might be the greatest miracle of the evening. She took his hand. "I always do," she said. And they danced. "Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories."